Joanna.
Oh, wait, are you?
No, I'm just going over here.
You're escorting me?
Yes.
I think maybe, one of the answers to that last question could be that your cookie scale computing allows you to engage more of the body, right? And you mentioned the finger versus the hand, but there's also this three-dimensionality. And, you can imagine, even though you didn't show this very much, but you can imagine putting these blocks on other parts of the body or playing with them in space, perhaps, which does segue into my presentation. Here we go. So I run a lab called Excess Labs, and excess is both a bit of a pun as to excess, and also it stands for extra soft, because what we attempt to do is to embed electronics in soft substrates, which involves both paper and textiles. And we make all kinds of both wearable applications, which is mostly what I'll talk about today. I'm only going to show garments today, but it's only a small part of what we do. We actually just do a whole bunch of R&D to try and develop methods, also working with other labs to develop new materials, using these new materials that have magical, various electromechanical properties, together with more traditional technologies from the world of textiles and garment making, in order to create samples, small textiles, big textiles. We do a lot of stuff for theater, for performance, for architectural spaces, but we also make dresses and garments that ask questions, perhaps. One of the things that I hope we'll talk a little bit during our discussion, is this idea of transitive materials or computational composites, which was also, I think, one of your last questions on your last slide, David. But we look at textiles for various kinds of bits of small computation. So things that can change color, change shape, transfer power. And most recently, I've become very interested in human-generated power and how can we enable that on the body, perhaps in playful and even grotesque ways. This is another one of our projects. The main topic of my little talk today is going to be garments as mobile media. And there's a few points that I want to make. One of them, I hadn't seen your slides actually, David, before I wrote this, and you had a whole bunch of disembodied hands, or they actually look like gloves, like white gloves on your slides, right? But so one of my points is to address this idea of disembodied hands and eyeballs. And to go back to one of the talks this morning, if an archaeologist or an alien from another planet were to come 100 years from now and find this heap of cell phones, how would they imagine our bodies? And I'm sure you've all seen these cartoons, right? They would imagine us as a species, as a thing with pens and eyeballs and very little else, right? A lot of the devices that do record our culture right now are basically aimed at hands and eyeballs, and there's very good reasons for that. Also, another point that I want to massage perhaps, is this idea of killer app. And I want to talk about things like pleasure, personal theater, desire, these things that actually are important to us, that do exist in our everyday lives, but often don't come up in discussions around these topics. Ideas of augmenting the body, but the full body, not just, specific performance-based applications and other kind of functionalities. I also want to bring up perhaps issues around gender. And gender is something that is either not mentioned at all in a lot of these discussions around computation, digital interfaces, etc., or it's done perhaps badly, or it's done in ways that are highly problematic. And gender is something that's very difficult to talk about, and it's very difficult to design. And garments, perhaps as a source of inspiration, do offer us a very rich history, both historically and across different cultures, of thinking about gender and representing gender, I suppose. Finally, the last point is this idea of social networking. Social networking, is something that started out as being very much on the full body, and this is a slide about evolution, right? And over time, as we lost our fur, we developed language and clothing. Clothing is not only for warmth and protection, but also has been used throughout history and across different cultures to signify and represent a whole bunch of social things that perhaps deal with wealth, social status, strength, different concepts of beauty, extreme beauty in our contemporary culture, professional affiliations, and individual identity. However, in the age of, I guess, the computer, the internet, mobile media, a lot of what we call social networking is no longer on the body. It exists in software, it exists on screens in these very disembodied ways. So I want to propose that perhaps it is time to bring these ideas of social networking back onto the body in some simple, very, very low resolution ways. So now I'll just show a quick survey of some of the projects that we do. We don't build platforms, we don't build generalized solutions, we build sketches of different possibilities, sketches that are meant to inspire or give a glimpse into different possible futures. One of the themes that I work with a lot deals with history and memory, and that is inspired by the way that history and memory is defined in the computer science world, and then looking at what that might mean on the body. The way that we develop our projects is we do a lot of sketching, a lot of playing. So for dealing with history and memory, what does history and memory mean on the body? We might start with just thinking, for instance, what if your dress remembered where you'd been touched? What if you could have a history of touch on the body? We have these large textile printers. We can print a whole bunch of dresses, quickly prototype them. We can make 20 of these in a couple of hours. And even just looking at these slides, you can quickly start thinking about, this person is very self-conscious and touches herself a lot and examines perhaps the way her clothes lay on her body, whereas these patterns of touch imply the presence of an other and are more sexual, right? We also look at using different kinds of materials that might represent history and memory on the body, such as thermochromic materials, and playing with patterns of camouflage and these metaphors of social camouflage. If somebody touches you or caresses you, your camouflage is deleted, is erased, and you become revealed and nude in a social cultural context. We also then try to deploy these kinds of simple interfaces in different contexts that includes dance performance. These are professional dancers who are asked to just play around, experiment with different choreographies of touch and ways that they can erase the patterns on each other's bodies and leave these traces of presence on each other's bodies. Of course, this kind of thing is much more acceptable in the performative context. You couldn't really wear this at the office, perhaps. But there's many different situations one can imagine that where this would be acceptable and even fun. We also then move into more of an electronics prototyping arena. So for instance, this is a project called the Intimate Memory Shirt and Skirt with different sensing modalities. So the skirt has these very simple analog, pressure-sensitive sensors that use conductive fabrics. It's all stitched. It's a very, very, very simple, elegant analog circuit that's stitched and beaded, just like one would stitch and bead embellishments on a blouse that has no electronics. And when somebody touches you or gropes you, these little elements illuminate and then fade over time to show how long it's been since that intimacy event has occurred. Similarly, the shirt has a little microphone. This one has a microcontroller, and it illuminates in response to breath events. So not noise, not sound, but really breath events. If somebody blows on your neck or whispers to you, again, it illuminates, and then turning off one by one shows the amount of time elapsed since that intimate contact took place. We've also looked at a lot of more complex kinds of electronics that we can deploy for mobile computing that can track and record bits of history and memory. This is a piece called the Bug, which is it's actually made out of silver, so it's a piece of jewelry. Jewelry is a very natural way of making mobile media. We already wear these bits of hardware, buttons, jewelry. We have all of these things on our bodies that are perhaps cookie scale. I was actually thinking, how can I continue this food naming scheme? And there's nothing that's really body size, but if we just think of a naming scheme that's about pleasure, as cookies are, I suppose, we can think of this as like bubble bath scale computing, perhaps, something that envelops your body fully. But so we have this bug that has all kinds of sensors that I won't go into that records things that happen to you during the day as you wear it, light events, movement events, sound events, etc. And when you come home, you can attach your bug to either your bedspread or some kind of wall hanging that is embellished with conductive threads that downloads the data, and then you can do whatever you want with that. I won't go into the many possibilities. We've also just experimented and played around with different ways that we can augment body language. Again, in very simple, very low-level computation, fun little things that we can do without actually needing to have a full computer on the body. So for instance, this is a project called Blazor with a microcontroller that just feeds data to these little lights. When you snap the snaps on your cuff, it both closes the circuit but also serves as a display. Your cuff links, your cuff little things, cuff snaps, start flashing in a pattern that looks like noise. It looks completely random, but if you wave your arm in space using retinal persistence, you can actually inscribe text in space. And you can do that in, for anything as pedestrian as just saying hello, but actually writing it, or actually leaving some kind of more provocative graffiti or communicating at these different levels. But it echoes natural body language, and what do I mean by natural body language? I don't know, not natural, but perhaps things that we already do now. We wave now, or at least I do. And if I were to wave and leave additional textual information in space, it could be an interesting experience. This is another set of sleeves. This is Vincent Leclerc, by the way, my old student who then went on to the MIT Media Lab. This is another set of sleeves that is augmented with just, these embroidered bits of conductive organza that as you fold your arms, whether you're cold or angry or even unconsciously crossing your arms to protect your personal space, the overall resistance of the circuit decreases and you hear a sound whose frequency increases as your body language becomes more sort of like renfermé, more closed, I guess. Is that closed or, closed upon yourself? So again, a very simple way of augmenting a gesture that we might already do. When you're relaxed and your arms are by your sides, the frequency of the sound is very low, like the sound a cat makes. What does a cat do when it goes like purr? Thank you. The purring of a cat. And as you start touching your arms and squeezing them tighter and tighter, the frequency goes up to the point of being very uncomfortable. Another very fun little project. I forgot what you said to do for the sound here. Could it be the volume, perhaps, knob? I think it's okay, right? Yeah, thank you. So these are just these embroidered coils in the tuxedo, and of course you can probably see that alligator clip, which is powering the tuxedo, but we actually did implement a solution for the catwalk with a portable battery source. But as you just rub your little magnet over the different embroidered coils in the tuxedo, which are purely textile, you can play different notes. This is Vincent Leclerc once again. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes? Okay. We also do a lot of work looking at textiles as displays, and textiles are displays. We do display things using textiles. But using computation and using digital media, we can modulate and control those displays, perhaps in real time, to display even more information. So we do a lot of stuff with things that light up, things that change color, but I'm specifically just going to show a couple of projects about shape change. And again, fun experiments we've done with inflating things. This is one of my favorite dresses. It just has these bladders and a little thing on the side, which is the sort of thing that you have in beach toys, and you actually can put your mouth on your shoulder and start inflating your own dress. And these protrusions kind of slowly grow out of your body. It's influenced by, again, animal behaviors, right, as you can imagine. We do a lot of performances. I teach in the fine arts faculty, so I have quite a lot of freedom to explore things such as this dress that you attach breasts to, which was a prototype for a different project. It's another story. But eventually we started working with shape memory alloys and nitinol and embedding them in different kinds of textiles. Going back to some of the stuff I mentioned earlier, this idea of transitive materials or computational composites, we actually make a lot of our own materials. So for instance, to make these flowers here that open and close on the shoulders of the dress, and I'll show you a video in just 1 second, we actually made our own felt. It's all hand felted. It's all, and the nitinol is integrated directly within the fibers as we make these materials. What's really wonderful about this is then the cut of the felt, the way that you cut it, the way that you construct it is actually a way of programming. It's a kind of a physical programming because depending on how many strands of nitinol you intersect and how the connections are made and how the nitinol is integrated, the behavior will be modulated just through the graphic design of the piece of felt that you're cutting. So these two dresses I just showed you are called Kukia and Vilkas, and the nitinol elements were very decorative, you know, a lot of references to the history of fashion, etc. But I wanted to push it a little bit further and look at ways that we could create garments that not only have these simple on-off or you know, the kind of open-closed languages embedded in them, but actually have behaviors and personalities. So I created this series of 5 dresses called the Scorpions, where I wanted the dresses to have quite an antagonistic relationship with the body. These are not interactive in the way that we think computers are interactive. You don't click in order to elicit the kind of behavior. They're pre-programmed, they move. And then you actually perhaps have to hold it down or pull on it the same way you pull on your regular clothes if they're not behaving properly. So again, starting out with a whole bunch of prototypes. And I just love the way this moves. It's very kind of anthropomorphic. It's not mechanical, you know. This is the final dress. This is another one. This is my favorite one, actually. I really wanted to make a garment that had these little openings, these little holes that would just open and close, both to allow air to circulate around the body, but also perhaps to allow people to peek through the dress. Of course, once we constructed it, it was like so kind of pornographic that we decided to line the back of the flaps with mirrored surfaces so that when the flaps open, let's see, is this playing? Yeah. So that when the flaps open, your gaze, again, to go back, somebody was talking about the gaze today, your gaze is reflected back at you in a very ironic way. But it also actually had this other wonderful effect with the mirrored lining that when they open and light is reflected on the mirrored hole, it gives this illusion that there is actually a hole all the way through the body, and you're looking from one side of the body to the other, and it's almost this perforation, this tunnel through the human body. You know, this stuff looks very playful and whatever, but I do publish papers in like IEEE conferences and ACM conferences just about the electronics and the engineering here as well. But what's very important to me is this very like small scale little bits of computation that can augment just our everyday activities. The last projects I'm going to show deal with parasitic metaphors around energy and around power. This is a project where the whole dress was a sort of like a breadboard, you know? I mean, this is very obvious here with the blue and the red. And you had one single power source, and you could attach these things, which are called the leeches, anywhere on the dress. There are many magnetic snaps, and they were powered from the one power source. You know, just as an exploration with many, many things that I could talk about. The Constellation Dresses also had small illuminating elements, almost like jewelry, decorative. The only way to turn them on was to get close enough to somebody else. The snaps, which were very strong magnets, would snap together and steal the power from somebody else's garment, very much like a parasite, another kind of parasite. And it actually did happen. You know, you didn't have to do it actively. It was almost this passive thing. These magnets were so strong, they would snap together, and you would power your own embellishment through somebody else's power source. But eventually, I just really wanted to make a collection of garments that could generate energy on the body. You know, this sort of stuff has been around for a really long time, and I even worked with Nike before I went into the fine arts. I had a company in Boston to try and make these sneakers that using piezovoltaic elements would change color depending on how fast you're running, etc. It turns out that it's very uncomfortable. It takes, turns out it takes a lot of work to generate power, and we ultimately are very lazy. So, we never went ahead with that project. On the other hand, if we think about fashion, the history of fashion is ripe with examples of discomfort being coupled with pleasure and sort of, I'm saying sort of. We had talked about this before, with desire being coupled with pain in a way, right? The high heels, the corsets, many, many examples we can think of. So fashion gives us a natural, perhaps, framework for looking at power generation, since it's more willing to accept discomfort. We did a whole bunch of sketches looking at different ways that one could create energy. This is also one of my research projects that I specifically brought into a class that I was teaching. I usually don't do that. And created these circuit boards that I distributed to students, created this whole platform, and asked them to think again about more intuitive kinds of activities to generate energy. So this is Catherine, and she created these boxing wraps with dynamo pull strings attached between the wrist and the shoulder, and as you start punching more and more, it charges the battery, which eventually feeds the LEDs that are on the knuckles, which is both metaphoric, which is at the point of impact, but can also then be used to make these long exposure drawings, I suppose. And finally, the ultimate manifestation of this project is a series of 3 dresses called Captain Electric and Battery Boy, where I'll just play this video. You actually manipulate the garments in semi-uncomfortable, awkward ways. They reference, these states of emergency and personal protection and anxieties and states of paranoia. And some of them you have to push, some of them you have to pull, some of them you have to turn, and it ultimately generates power and creates these media events on the body. So I will just end with this, and hopefully this will inject yet another completely different perspective into our discussions of future interfaces, specifically thinking of the whole body as our interaction platform.
Fantastic. Time maybe for 1, 2 questions? You're not off the hook.
I'm always distressed by the general denial of body and sort of the anxiety around person and sexuality and gender that exists in the computer science community and in tech in general. And it's something that I think a lot about. If you were to remove that constraint completely from your work, just like assume a level playing field where that anxiety doesn't exist, and this work doesn't have to exist as a response to that. So it could just go out into a kid's school or into a woman's wardrobe without any resistance. What's the one thing you hope to share with that person?
What do you mean by share?
Like what would be a motivator or a message or a transmission that you want to make to a person aside from the sort of politics of the body, the sexuality and stuff like that, removing those layers and getting down to sort of the core behavior or moment that you want someone to have or would like someone to have with a garment of this type? Would it be play? Would it be expression? Would it be?
It would be pleasure and fashion,
pleasure.
Right? And just think about, this is pleasurable because it makes me feel a certain way, it fits well, etc. So I think that we don't need to actually have a different set of functionalities or functions or aims or, usage of these devices just because they have computation or digital media in them. It doesn't mean that they have to become something completely other, right? They can just change in small ways, and that's a lot of the work that we do.
So just the responsiveness of the object would create a sense of pleasure in the person, just sort of akin to being around, say, a small animal or a living thing.
Or even a really gorgeous piece of silk, right? Which moves in a certain way, it feels a certain way, it reflects light in a certain way, but just making that a little bit more complex and perhaps less intuitive, because the physical world is more intuitive than the digital world.
So like a sensation amplifier, kind of.
yet another level of material. You know, it's kind of, we used to have, I forget what the language is, but we used to have a kind of materials that were more traditional materials. Now we have composite materials that already have multiple functionalities and that do magical things, you know, like fabrics that let water out but not in, etc., right? So just to take that to yet another level.
Awesome, thanks.
Anyone else quickly? Okay.
Thank you.